Hey folks, I'm Allison. Welcome to my BookTube channel. Today's video is a review of the books that I read in January and February 2025. Let's get started. The first book that I read in January 2025 was Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I'm not going to talk extensively about this book in this video because I did an entire review of Intermezzo in another video and I will link it, but I really enjoyed this book and I gave it an 8 out of 10 stars. The second book that I read was When We Lost Our Heads by Heather O'Neill. This book falls into the category of what I would consider hot girl horror, along the lines of Bunny by Mona Awad and My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. It really balances the fun, aesthetic hot girl elements with really creepy horror, suspense, some sort of gross, violent imagery, standard kind of horror stuff. One fun thing about this book, though, is that it has a social justice twist that isn't present in some similar books that I've read. The book follows the friendship of two rich young women in early 19th century Montreal, starting in their childhood and following them through adulthood. While it tells this story, the book explores the way that class and money can influence politics, the way that the power imbalance between the extremely wealthy and the working class lead to abuse, often, sexual violence and coercion, the difference in the way that the law applies to the extremely wealthy or doesn't apply in many cases to the extremely wealthy versus the way that it can be really oppressive, applied in a really oppressive way to the poor and to other people sort of on the margins of society. But it also has, I thought, an unexpectedly uplifting ending. It is very, very roughly based around some working class uprisings in Montreal that actually took place. Obviously, nothing in the book, everything in the book is completely, fantastical and made up. But it is set in a real historical period and feels quite grounded in some of the class dynamics that were at the forefront of people's minds in that period. It had some really good messages about the power of regular people when they band together to stand against oppression of various forms. But it also did a good job of exploring the nuance in the way that, coalition building can be incredibly difficult, and you get some people who are there for the right reasons and a lot of people who are not there for the right reasons, and some people who are willing to stand up for themselves and others, and a lot of people who are only interested in standing up to oppression when it directly impacts them. And I thought that was a really fun angle for this book, because the other sort of hot girl horror books that I think of, thinking of like Bunny and My Year of Rest and Relaxation, they do talk about class, but in a very narrow interpersonal kind of way, talking about relatively middle to upper middle class people feeling like they have less money than their peers. And this book really talks about class in the sort of society at large, oligarchic oppression kind of way. And I thought that was fun and, quite timely. It was like a very cathartic book, I think, for the present moment that we're living through. One significant drawback of all of that, though, is that because the book followed two rich, ultra rich characters, they were massively unlikable. And even though I was kind of rooting for them and kind of shipping them the whole time, I also kind of hated them the whole time, and that caused a really weird cognitive dissonance in the reading experience that honestly, I'm not sure I was really all there for. On the other hand, one thing I unexpectedly really loved about this book was all of the queer representation, sort of start to finish. The way that the back of the book describes the relationship between the two protagonists makes it seem like it's going to be and I even, in my TBR video, when I first bought this book and was thinking about reading it, I was thinking it was going to be a sort of spicy friendship book, a la Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, or My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. And it is not. It is a lesbian romance, which was awesome. I really, really enjoyed that. There are lots of gay characters and even sort of a questionably trans character, although that character doesn't really have the language to express what they're going through, so it's a little hard to know specifically. But generally, broad queer representation in this book, some, nice queer steamy scenes, and that was an unexpected perk. The last quick thing I'll say about this book is that, as you might expect from this kind of hot girl horror, there were times where we were sort of vibe setting for a really long time. There'd be like multiple paragraphs describing like one person's frilly dress, and I ended up skipping some of those. I got kind of bored. So that would be another minor criticism. But overall, I really liked it. I would rate it a solid 7 out of 10 stars. And quick trigger warning, there is some depiction of rape and sexual assault. The next books that I read were The Villain's Duology by V.E. Schwab. So Vicious is the first book, and then Vengeful is the second. I love V.E. Schwab and had really high hopes for these books. Vicious definitely lived up to my expectations, but Vengeful for me was kind of a letdown. The books follow the friendship between two young men starting when they're in college, and they perform a dangerous experiment that results in them developing extraordinary powers. And then it follows them into adulthood, dealing with the consequences and the sort of breakdown of their friendship. Vicious focuses primarily on the two main characters, and there are a few other secondary characters that sort of float in and out of the books that are pretty fun, but the real thrust of the book is the relationship between Victor and Eli. And I really enjoyed that. In Vengeful, we get a really great additional origin story for Eli. Vicious is told basically from Victor's perspective, and Vengeful you get a combination of Victor and Eli's perspectives. You spend a lot more time in Eli's head, which is really fun. But Vengeful, the main sort of plot arc follows a third character, Marcella, on basically like a revenge quest against her mob boss husband who was cheating on her. And it just felt random. I spent a lot of time in that book following around Marcella and then this other character, June, who also, it's just a little unclear what they're really doing in the story. Their story arc gets tied into Victor and Eli's story arc, kind of, but not in a way that felt particularly organic to me. And I just got kind of bored. I was really into the Victor and Eli chapters and found myself kind of rushing to get through the stuff about June and Marcella, but that ended up being a lot of the book. And so in the end, I just didn't find Vengeful nearly as compelling as Vicious. And that was unexpected for me. When I read the backs of these books, I was much more excited for Vengeful than I was for Vicious, because Vengeful sounds like it's about this badass female, like, assassin lady going on a revenge quest. Amazing. Vicious sounds like it's about, nerdy tech bros getting into a fight. So from my expectations, it really did not turn out how I expected. But that said, I still enjoyed them. I would give Vicious an 8 out of 10 and Vengeful maybe a 6 out of 10. The next book that I read was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. I don't have a ton to say about this book. It is a very cozy, sweet book about a witch who goes to mentor some teenage witches in the English countryside and finds a sort of misfit found family and a, cute romance. And I liked it fine. The plot was pretty predictable. She goes, there's some initial awkwardness as everybody feels each other out, and then they, fall in love with each other, and then, outside forces try to interfere, and then they team up and persevere. It's exactly the kind of plot arc that you would expect from looking at the cover of this book. And the romance is one where, 10 pages in, you know exactly who's going to end up with who and how it's all going to break down. So it wasn't one of those books where I was like desperate to know what happened, desperate to keep reading. But it is definitely a comfort book. One thing about this book, it's not really tugging at your heartstrings. It's not really taking you on an emotional roller coaster. It is, as the little description on the front of the book says, it's a warm and witchy hug of a book. And I think that's exactly my main takeaway. When people talk about writing, they often say, show, don't tell. And the author of this book does a lot of telling, not showing. So she originally describes some sort of traumatic events that the characters went through. And then when things are happening, when the characters are, you know, acting in irrational ways or are making choices or are just reacting generally, she will say things like, and then the character remembered X traumatic event and then did Y thing. And, you know, I get it. She's telling you this is, you know, her traumas motivating her actions. This is why this character's acting this way. Fine. And I think there is some benefit to doing it that way, as opposed to like really dragging your reader through all this trauma, in that like you can read this book when you're in a delicate emotional place and it's not gonna rock you. This is a book that you can read when you are already sort of on the edge and you just need something that will be comforting and mellow and have a happy ending. So the things about this book that I found to be sort of shortcomings, I think there is probably a large group of people for whom those would be pros. But for me, I found it a little boring. I'd give this book a 6 out of 10, but with the caveat that I think a lot of people would probably like it a lot more than I did. The next book that I read was Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. And I picked this book up, actually, I should say, I picked this book up and The Society of Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I picked both of those up at a charity book sale, so I got them for $5 each, which was really exciting for me because I'm really trying not to spend a bunch of money buying new books, that sort of thing. I think the only books that I bought new that I read this month, so Intermezzo was given to me as a gift, and I bought When We Lost Our Heads new. And I bought the V.E. Schwab duology new. But I think those 3 books are the only ones that I bought new. And then everything else I read either came in through my little free library, or I got at this really great charity book sale, or was gifted to me. Anyways, but back to Skyward. This is the first in a YA fantasy series by Brandon Sanderson. And I think that sentence is kind of everything you really need to know about this book. So Brandon Sanderson is obviously a master at telling an incredibly page-turning, engaging story. And this book was no exception. I flew through it. I think I read it in, you know, maybe 2 sittings. It's also, you know, because it's YA, like, it's pretty short. Like, if you look at sort of how big the text is on the page, like, you get through it a lot faster than, you know, like Mistborn, for instance, was a romp and I didn't want to put it down, and it still took me like a few, you know, 3 or 4 sittings to get through it just because it was like kind of long. But this one I really tore through. But it is like a true YA novel. So it's about this young girl who is training to be a spaceship pilot so that she can fight in a war against aliens. And, you know, she's living in a sort of dystopian planet with a ragtag sort of survivors of humanity and, you know, fighting off aliens who are attacking them. And the main themes are sort of growing up, learning to, you know, stand in your own power and figure out who you are and what you want and how to be authentically yourself. And all of that is great. And I'm super pro, but it's the kind of thing that you would think, oh yeah, these are the kind of struggles that a teenager would be dealing with. And this is the kind of book that a teenager might get a lot out of reading because it helps you process the kinds of things you're going through in a way that I spent a lot of the book being like, oh, sweetie, like, it's gonna be okay, I promise. The moral quandaries were pretty shallow, and the morality of the characters was pretty black and white. You know, you had the good guys and the bad guys, and sometimes there were bad guys that actually were good guys and they were just acting on incomplete information, but there wasn't really any shades of gray, like mushy, gritty humanity kinds of questions in this book. And it's been a long time since I read a genuinely YA book. There have been a bunch of books that I've read fairly recently that have teenage protagonists. I'm thinking like Gideon the Ninth or A Deadly Education. And in my mind, I had really been thinking of those as YA books. I was sort of like, oh yes, fantasy books about teenagers, those are YA books. And reading this, I really understood the difference between a fantasy book about a teenager and a YA fantasy book. For that reason, I probably won't continue reading this series, even though I did enjoy this book. I'd probably give this a 7 out of 10. And if you were recommending it for someone in the sort of middle school, early high school age bracket, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Okay, we're getting to the good stuff. This was my first 10 out of 10 read of the year, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. It's just amazing. Get it, read it. Really, seriously, right now, I cannot say enough good things about this book. I didn't think that it was going to be as good as it turned out. This is a book that came in through my little free library, and I had seen it all over the internet, maybe just because of the cover art, honestly. Or I had thought, let me say this, I had the misconception that because of the cover art, this book had gotten a lot of hype on, BookTube, Bookstagram, Book Talk, that had more to do with cozy vibes and aesthetic than it did to do with necessarily being a great book. And it is not. This book deserves every word of hype that it has gotten on the internet. It's amazing. It is a cozy vibes aesthetic book, and at the same time is absolutely heart-wrenching. It is such a wonderful, authentic and philosophical exploration of deep questions sort of at the core of relationships, and it is doing all of the cozy things that a book like Secret Society of Irregular Witches is doing. And when I first read that book, before reading this book, thought, I probably shouldn't judge that book too harshly because it's really hard, I imagine, to do both the cozy thing and the depth thing. And then this book did it so flawlessly that I judge that one a little bit more harshly now than I had before I read this book. So this book is broken up into 4 chapters, and it's a novel, and each of the chapters kind of functions as a standalone short story, but with the same characters throughout, and you get context in the earlier stories that help you understand the later stories. So chapter 1 of this book really could stand alone as a short story, and then chapter 4 kind of could, but you'd be missing a lot. Because it's set in those sort of 4 distinct story arcs, it has the sort of short story feel of delving deeply into one philosophical question in a really short span. And I loved that. I thought that was fabulous. And it balanced that really well with the sort of novel quality of making me want to keep reading. Backing up a little bit, it tells the story of these characters working in a coffee shop, and they're basically regular customers. And in this coffee shop is a chair that can send you back in time, but you can only go back in time while you're sitting in the chair. If you go back in time, you're stuck in the chair. And so the only people you can interact with back in time were the other people who happen to be in the coffee shop at the time you've gone back to. And you can only be in the chair for 5 minutes, about however long it takes your coffee. They give you a coffee, and when the coffee gets cold, you come back into the present, and you can't change anything. And so with those constraints, it explores this question of what can you do with that time? If you could go back and just have a conversation that you'd had with someone, not to change the outcome, but just to change the experience of having that conversation for you and them. Would that be worthwhile? And that is such a fun, interesting question. It's in a lot of ways a book about how our perspective on things is the only thing we really have control over. We can choose how we're going to react to a situation, and it's just a really beautiful exploration of what that means for people going through a variety of difficult situations. I really, really loved it. I can't say enough good things. And one other thing, this book is in translation, and it is still really lovely. Sometimes books in translation lose a little bit of the literary flavor, I think, of the original. And this one, there are maybe 2 places where the translation is a little jarring, where one of the characters will use a slang term, and it'll be translated into a slang term that feels kind of out of place. But most of the time I would not have even noticed. 10 out of 10, Before the Coffee Gets Cold. The next book that I read was Divergent by Veronica Roth. I know Veronica Roth has a lot of stans out there, and so I want to say, don't come for me. I didn't really like this book that much. And I apologize, it's just my opinion. If you love this book, no judgment. Everyone likes different things. And this, again, is a YA book. And it was interesting for me to read two genuinely YA books in the same sort of short span of time, because as I said, I don't really read a lot of true YA. And I noticed, again, a lot of the things about Skyward that made it feel a bit too young for me were also present in this book. And so some of my criticism is certainly arising from that. But the book is about a young woman who lives in a society that is divided into 5 factions. And each faction is aspiring to equality. So she's from a faction that's aspiring to selflessness, and there's like one aspiring to happiness and one to knowledge and one to bravery. And when the protagonist is 16, she has the opportunity to switch factions. And she does. She leaves the selflessness faction, which is the one she grew up in, and goes to the bravery faction. And then most of the book is just about her like going through a probationary period to train to try to become a full-fledged member of the bravery faction. The biggest problem that I had with this book is that the bravery faction is really more of a violence and sadism faction. And the book talks about that. The book, there are characters in the book who say, oh, it used to be more about bravery in terms of protecting people, not bravery in terms of being willing to jump off a building or kick somebody when they're down. But the way that it's presented at the time that the main character is trying to join this faction, it just is about violence and sadism. They're like making the recruits jump off buildings to their death or, beat each other to death. And the main character's choice just seems really bad. Like she left the selflessness faction, which to be fair seemed really boring, but then, moved to this faction where she's maybe gonna die or get beaten to death or like beat her friends to death. And that just seemed like a terrible choice. And the book really was not able to convince me that it was a good choice. But the main character kept saying over and over, oh my gosh, I'm way too selfish of a person to have stayed in the selflessness faction. Thank goodness I moved to the bravery faction because I love this. I'm getting off on the violence and the danger. And that really was not that convincing. Like having portraying this stuff as really awful and then just having the main character say, oh, actually this is so great, didn't convince me that it was actually great, and just was really alienating. Like it made me think the main character is kind of a shit person. And so it was really hard for me to then care about following her through this training program to join this like terrible faction and essentially like develop kind of the worst parts of her personality. So I really struggled with that. And the other thing that I found difficult is that I didn't think this book really had a message. It's the kind of book that seems like it thinks it has something deep to say. It like thinks that it's a Hunger Games, but its message was society doesn't need to be divided into 5 factions. People have different aspects to their personalities or something like that, except that what are you fighting against? Like no one, I don't think anyone is sitting around thinking, oh, everyone only has one major characteristic to their personality. And the thing about the main character that made her like the chosen one is that she went through this test that determined that she wasn't best suited for one specific faction. She could have been in multiple factions. But if the point of the book is that this sort of factioning of society is harmful, why is Divergent so rare? Shouldn't lots of people get that result? If the vast majority of people in the society are taking this test and it's telling them, oh, you're really suited for this one specific faction, that makes me think that this system kind of works for this society. So I just didn't really understand what the point of the whole book was, basically. And then the last thing about this book that I didn't like, and this is really on me. This is my fault for reading a YA book. But the protagonist is 16, and they say over and over and over again that she's 16 and that her love interest is 18. And then they have some kind of steamy, flirty makeout scenes. And ew, I was just like, I had to honestly skip those scenes because it was just too, reading about, like, it was presented in a way that it's like supposed to be steamy to readers. And that's cool because the readers are supposed to be 16, reading about 16-year-olds being like, wow, this is steamy. But for me, it was like, I really couldn't do it. So I think Divergent's 5 out of 10. I mean, I didn't DNF this book. You know, I read this book in a few sittings. There was no point where I was reading it where I was like, oh, I'm bored, I'm gonna put it down. You know, it is a page turner. It's a fun story. It just felt like there wasn't a lot of substance there. So 5 out of 10 for Divergent. Okay, we're almost finished, y'all. Last book, Second Place by Rachel Cusk. I haven't read the Outline trilogy, but reading this book really made me want to because I really enjoyed it. I think Rachel Cusk is a great writer, and I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to explore more of her writing. This book is a pretty simple story about a middle-aged woman and her husband who live out in sort of a rural, marshy area, and they invite an artist that she admires to come stay in their guest house. They have a sort of regular practice of inviting artists to come stay in their guest house and, you know, just provide them with access to higher culture or whatever, because they're pretty isolated and the wife is sort of artsy. And there's a sort of personality dysfunction between them and the artist that comes to stay and this friend of the artist who comes with him and the main character's daughter and the daughter's boyfriend, who all end up there at the same time. And so the basic premise of the story is pretty straightforward. And, you know, you can see it's not that long of a book, but the philosophy of this book was amazing. A lot of the book is the main character's sort of internal musings about the things that are going on. And she has really interesting thoughts. So one of the big themes is like the way that conventions, particularly conventions around femininity and being a wife and being a mother, can be really like restrictive and stifling on somebody, but at the same time can also be a massive source of stability and, you know, can help people live in community and know how to interact with and relate to one another. And so I thought the sort of pull and push of that exploration was really cool. It also talks about aging and the sort of way that people hang on to vanity and the sort of tragic and comedic outcomes of that. It talks about a lot about art, you know, a lot about the role of art in society and the connection between art and the humans who make it. To what extent do we sort of interpret art in a death of the author way versus to what extent should we be viewing humans through the lens of the art that they're making? I don't think any answers really, but just a lot of an investigation of some really interesting questions in a very, I thought, unpretentious, sort of grounded, very, you know, beautiful, idyllic, natural setting of this very like isolated marsh. So I really, really enjoyed this book. It's, you know, beautifully written, and I give this a 9 out of 10. There you have it. Those were the books that I read in January and February this year. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video. Goodbye.